The interstellar academy on Zenith 7 floated in the gravitational sweet spot between three suns, which was either a marvel of astrophysical engineering or the universe's way of showing off. Probably both. The station had been constructed 2 centuries ago by the Collective Council of Advanced Species. Yes, they actually called themselves that without a trace of irony. As a neutral ground where the galaxy's most promising young minds could gather, learn, and occasionally try to kill each other in supervised settings. Education, it turned out, was a universal constant. So was teenage stupidity, though that particular phenomenon manifested differently across species. The Vrillians expressed it through complex mathematical proofs that technically proved nothing. The Nostari demonstrated it via interpretive dance that violated several laws of physics. Humans, as everyone had discovered over the past 30 years since first contact, expressed it through what could only be described as weaponized audacity mixed with an alarming disregard for survival instincts. The Academy itself was a masterwork of architectural compromise. Corridors wide enough for the slug-like Morthians, but not so wide that the diminutive Pixians felt like they were crossing a desert. Gravity generators adjusted every 50 meters to accommodate species that evolved everywhere, from crushing gas giants to practically weightless asteroids. The cafeteria alone required 17 different atmospheric zones and had given up entirely on the concept of universal mealtimes, when your student body included species that ate once a decade and others that needed to consume their body weight daily. Scheduling lunch became a philosophical nightmare. Combat Theory 407 was held in Lecture Hall Gamma, a sprawling amphitheater that could hold 300 students of varying sizes, shapes, and states of matter. Professor Krell Zach, a Vortinian whose species resembled what would happen if you gave a praying mantis a doctoral degree and a serious caffeine addiction, presided over the class with the weary patience of someone who had been teaching teenagers for 40 years and had the stress molting to prove it. The course was mandatory for all students in the tactical programs, which meant it attracted exactly the sort of individuals you'd expect. Idealistic warriors, calculating strategists, naive peacekeepers who thought they could talk their way out of everything, and humans who approached combat with the same enthusiasm they brought to every other inadvisable activity. The classroom buzzed, literally in the case of the Zentharian students, with pre-lecture conversation. Holographic displays floated above desks, showing everything from homework assignments to last night's zero-gravity handball championship. The ambient translator systems worked overtime, converting the cacophony of clicks, whistles, subsonic rumbles, and pheromone bursts into comprehensible dialogue. Near the back of the Ha-Noshka amphitheater, taking up 3 seats because his species simply came in extra large, sat Vexthor of the Corinthian warrior caste. If central casting had needed someone to play the role of alien who will definitely start trouble, Vexthor would have gotten the part without an audition. He stood roughly 8 feet tall when fully extended, which was most of the time because standing at anything less than full height was considered a sign of weakness in Corinthian culture. His exoskeleton bore the deep crimson coloring that marked him as warrior caste. With ceremonial scarring that formed patterns his people found meaningful, and everyone else found vaguely threatening. Corinthians had made a name for themselves as one of the galaxy's premier warrior species, which was a polite way of saying they'd fought everyone they'd ever met and kept detailed records of the results. 300 years of military history had given them a well-earned reputation, and Vexthor carried that legacy like a badge of honor, or more accurately, like a really large chip on his really large shoulder. "Did you see the simulation results from yesterday?" Vexthor's voice rumbled through his translator, carrying the natural harmonics that Corinthians use to intimidate prey. The human cohort managed to fail 3 separate engagement scenarios. 3. My clutchmates were running successful planetary assaults when we were half their age. His companion, a Telvari named Kix, who served as something between a friend and an audience, made a sound that the translator interpreted as agreeable laughter. To be fair, humans have only been spacefaring for what? A few decades? We cannot expect nothing, and you will still be disappointed, Vexthor interrupted, which was apparently a Corinthian proverb, though it sounded more like a fortune cookie written by someone having a really bad day. They strut around with their soft bodies and their fragile bones, acting as if being clever compensates for being weak. In real combat, intelligence means nothing if you cannot survive the first strike. This was, objectively speaking, terrible military theory. Most of the greatest commanders in galactic history had won precisely because they'd survived first strikes through clever positioning, superior intelligence, or occasionally just really good luck. But Vexithor had built his entire personality around the concept of overwhelming physical superiority, and changing his mind would require either personal growth or humiliating defeat. Guess which one was more likely to happen in the next hour. 15 rows down and off to the left, sitting in a seat scaled for smaller species, was the human who would soon make Vexthor's day considerably worse. She sat with the relaxed posture of someone either completely comfortable or practicing exceptional situational awareness while appearing comfortable. Probably the latter. But she sold it well enough that most observers assume the former. She'd arrived at the academy 6 months ago as part of the third wave of human students, young enough to learn the curriculum, but old enough to have actually lived a life before, trading Earth's gravity for Zenith 7's carefully calibrated compromise. Her appearance was unremarkable by human standards. Average height for her species, dark hair pulled back in a practical style, features that suggested ancestry from several continents back when continental ancestry had mattered. She wore the Academy's standard tactical uniform without modification or personalization, which made her stand out primarily by not standing out at all. Other students had largely dismissed her. The Corinthians found her physically unimpressive. The Nostari thought her movement patterns lacked aesthetic grace. The Vrillians had calculated her probable combat effectiveness and filed her under statistically irrelevant. Even other humans in the program had mostly written her off as someone who'd probably wash out by second year. They'd all made the same fundamental mistake, assuming that quiet meant timid, and that careful observation indicated uncertainty rather than constant threat assessment. In their defense, these were easy mistakes to make. She didn't boast about her capabilities, didn't feel the need to demonstrate her skills during every training exercise, didn't engage in the social posturing that marked so many student interactions. She simply watched, learned, and occasionally smiled at some private joke that no one else understood. Professor Krell-Zak entered the lecture hall with the clicking gait of his species, his multiple limbs carrying him to the central podium. "Settle," he said, and the ambient translator gave his voice a dry, professorial quality that somehow survived translation. Today we discuss asymmetric warfare and the dangerous assumptions that get soldiers killed. Pay attention because statistically, 3 of you will ignore this lesson and suffer for it. He wasn't wrong. Statistics kept by the Academy showed that overconfidence led to more training injuries than actual accidents. Of course, the line between an accident and someone learning a hard lesson was sometimes debatable. Asymmetric warfare, Krell-Zak continued, manipulating the holographic display to show various historical battles, occurs when opposing forces have significantly different military capabilities or methodologies. The weaker force must compensate through superior tactics, environmental advantages, or exploiting the stronger force's assumptions. Vexithor made a sound that his translator rendered as a derisive snort. The weaker force typically dies. Superior strength prevails unless the opposition is incompetent enough to allow tricks to matter. Krelzak's compound eyes focused on Vexithor with the expression of a teacher who'd heard this exact argument approximately 9,000 times. Thank you for volunteering an opinion that perfectly demonstrates the kind of thinking that gets commanders killed. Strength matters, yes. But assumptions about strength matter more. Philosophy is for species too weak to fight properly, Vexithor said. And several Corinthian students made clicking sounds that indicated approval. In real combat, the stronger warrior wins, unless luck intervenes. Interesting theory, Krelzak said in a tone that suggested it was anything but interesting. Perhaps we should test it. Would anyone like to provide a practical demonstration of how assumptions affect combat outcomes? The human's hand went up. Not dramatically, not hesitantly, just a simple raising of her arm that somehow drew every eye in the amphitheater. Vexithor's attention locked onto her like targeting sensors acquiring a threat. Or in this case, what he perceived as an opportunity. The human wishes to contribute? This should prove amusing. She stood, and the translator systems picked up her voice with crystal clarity. I'd like to challenge the assertion that physical superiority determines combat outcomes. With permission, I propose a practical demonstration. The lecture hall went very quiet. Even species without traditional hearing organs seemed to sense that something interesting was about to happen. Students started leaning forward. Someone in the back row began recording. Vexithor rose to his full height, which involved a lot of exoskeleton and intimidation. You wish to challenge Corinthian combat doctrine? You, who comes from a species that evolved chasing prey until it died of exhaustion because you were too weak to kill it directly? That's actually a pretty effective hunting strategy, she said conversationally. We conquered an entire planet with it. But yes, I'm challenging your assertion, unless you'd prefer to keep your doctrine theoretical rather than tested. Oh, that was well played. Questioning a Corinthian's willingness to fight was like questioning a fish's willingness to swim. Vexithor's entire cultural identity revolved around martial prowess. Backing down now would humiliate him far more than any potential defeat. Professor, Vexithor said, his voice carrying the kind of eager anticipation usually reserved for predators spotting injured prey. I volunteer to educate this human on the realities of combat. Consider it a practical lesson for the entire class. Krelzak's antennae twitched in what species familiar with Vortinians recognized as resignation. This is probably inadvisable, but I've learned that students sometimes need to learn lessons directly. Very well. Arena 3 is available. Standard safety protocols, non-lethal engagement parameters, match ends at first incapacitation or submission. The migration to Arena 3 resembled a prison break if prison breaks were organized, enthusiastic, and involved multiple species with different locomotion methods. Students flowed through corridors, spreading news of the upcoming match through communication networks, both official and decidedly not, by the time the main participants arrived. The observation galleries were packed with species who absolutely should have been in other classes, but had somehow collectively decided that education was optional when entertainment was available. Arena 3 was a multi-purpose combat space, capable of adjusting its environmental parameters to accommodate different species requirements. For this match, it settled on standard gravity, Earth normal atmosphere composition as a compromise, and a basic flat floor with marked boundaries. No obstacles, no environmental advantages, just two combatants and a lot of open space, where bad decisions could unfold with maximum visibility. The human entered from one side, performing basic stretches that looked almost comically casual given the circumstances. Vexathor entered from the opposite side, and even species unfamiliar with body language could read the aggressive confidence in his posture. He performed a traditional Corinthian pre-combat ritual that involved a lot of exoskeleton clicking and what the translators interpreted as a war poem, but might have just been very aggressive trash talk. Current odds are 15-1 in Vexthor's favor. Someone announced, because students had immediately established betting pools. 20-1 if she's incapacitated in under 30 seconds. The human smiled slightly, which several observers noted but none correctly interpreted. Professor Krelzak's voice echoed through the arena's speakers. Standard combat rules apply. Fight ends at incapacitation, submission, or if I decide you're both being idiots and need to stop. Begin. Vexthor moved first, because of course he did. Corinthian combat doctrine emphasized aggressive openings, overwhelming force, and the kind of intimidation that made opponents hesitate. He crossed the arena in 3 massive strides, one clawed limb sweeping toward the human in an arc that would have sent her flying if it connected. It didn't connect. She'd already moved, sliding under his reach with efficient economy of motion. No wasted movement, no dramatic flourishes, just practical displacement that put her outside his immediate threat range. Vexathor adjusted, pivoting with surprising speed for something his size. Another strike. This one a downward slam that would have driven her into the floor. She sidestepped, and his limb hit the arena surface with a thunderous impact that sent vibrations through the observation gallery. She's running, someone commented, and several students made sounds of agreement. Except she wasn't running. She was moving with purpose, each displacement taking her to specific positions around the arena. Vexthor pressed his attack, throwing strikes with a kind of power that didn't need precision when it could simply overwhelm defenses through sheer kinetic energy. Each attack missed by carefully calculated margins. Stand and fight, Vexthor roared, frustration entering his voice. Hitting things was supposed to be straightforward. You moved fast, hit hard, opponent fell down. This wasn't following the script. The human didn't respond verbally. She was too busy conducting a detailed threat assessment while making it look like desperate evasion. Weight distribution, front heavy. Recovery time between strikes, 1.2 seconds. Preferred attack angles, high to low, maximizing gravity and reach advantage. Defensive gaps, everywhere, because his entire strategy was offense as defense. Vexthor charged again, this time attempting a grapple. If he could get his limbs around her, the fight would end immediately. Corinthian strength could crush most personal armor, let alone unaugmented flesh. She dropped low, rolled, came up behind him. For the first time since the match began, she struck, a precise kick to the joint cluster at the back of his left leg. Not hard enough to damage, but perfectly placed to send feedback through his neural network. Vexathor stumbled, just slightly, just enough to throw off his next attack. His confidence cracked around the edges. The observation gallery got noticeably quieter. Students who'd been watching entertainment were starting to realize they might be watching education. The human pressed her advantage, but not in the way Vexthor expected. She didn't try to match his power or trade blows. Instead, she became a persistent problem, striking at joints, tendons, and neural clusters that Corinthians needed for coordinated movement. Each hit was technically minor. Cumulatively, they were dismantling his combat effectiveness piece by piece. She's using pressure point targeting, someone in the gallery said with dawning realization. Corinthian neurology. She knows where their motor control pathways run. Vexthor realized it too, which was unfortunate for him, because realization came with the understanding that he'd been outclassed from the opening second. Every evasion had been positional maneuvering. Every desperate dodge had been setting up her next strike. She'd been fighting the entire time. He just hadn't recognized it as fighting because it didn't match his expectations. He switched tactics, trying to use his reach advantage to keep her at distance. Smart move, but implemented 3 minutes too late. She'd already mapped his patterns, identified his tells, calculated his reaction times. When he extended for a strike, she was already moving into the gap it created. When he pulled back to defend, she was exploiting the moment of transition. A strike to his right shoulder joint collapsed his guard on that side. A sweep at his forward leg compromised his stance. A palm strike to his central thorax hit exactly where Corinthian respiratory spiracles clustered, forcing his system to compensate for suddenly reduced oxygen intake. Vexthor was strong, incredibly strong. In a test of pure power, he would have dominated. But this wasn't a test of power. This was a practical examination of what happens when training meets someone who'd actually done this before in situations where losing meant dying instead of just academic embarrassment. He tried one final desperate maneuver, throwing all his remaining strength into an overhead strike that would have ended the fight if it landed. The human didn't evade. She stepped forward, inside his reach, where his limbs couldn't generate full force. Her elbow drove upward into his jaw joint with surgical precision, snapping his head back. Simultaneously, she hooked his forward leg and used his own momentum against him. 8 feet of Corinthian warrior crashed to the arena floor with a sound like thunder having a percussion ensemble. Before he could recover, she had his primary arm hyperextended at an angle that Corinthian joints absolutely could not support, her knee against his thorax, and enough leverage that any attempt to move would result in something dislocating painfully. "Yield," she said quietly, and the arena's microphones picked it up perfectly. Vexthor made a sound that the translators struggled with before settling on pained agreement. She released him immediately, stepped back, and offered a hand to help him up. He stared at it for a long moment, pride warring with the dawning realization that refusing would make this somehow worse. He took her hand. She helped him stand, which was generous given that he probably outweighed her by 300 pounds. The observation gallery exploded into noise. Multiple languages, all expressing variations of shock, excitement, and "did you see that?" overlapping into linguistic chaos. Currency changed hands as betting pools settled. Someone started a slow clap that spread through several species who understood the gesture. Professor Krelzak's voice cut through the noise. "I believe that concludes today's practical demonstration on why assumptions get soldiers killed. Would either participant like to add commentary?" Vexthor looked at the human with an expression that his species used to indicate respect earned through combat. "Where did you learn Corinthian neural mapping?" "Military training back home," she said. "We didn't have your strength or reach, so we studied weaknesses instead. Turns out most species have them. The universe is efficient that way." "Military training," Vexthor repeated slowly. "You said you were in the tactical program." "I am now. Before that, I was in the military. Close protection detail, actually. Kept people alive in situations where others wanted them very dead." She said it matter-of-factly, like she was discussing her favorite color rather than a career that involved life or death stakes. "Took early retirement after the peace treaties. Figured I'd get formal education. Seemed like a good idea." The observation gallery processed this information. Several students were hurriedly accessing Earth's recent history files, pulling up records of humanity's various conflicts and the specialist roles they'd developed. Close protection, details for high-value targets in hostile environments. The kind of job where you learn to fight anything, anywhere with whatever worked. Professor Krelzak's antennae did something complicated. Perhaps you'd like to share insights on asymmetric combat with the class, since we've moved beyond theory into practical demonstration. She shrugged. Most species are stronger than humans. Faster reflexes, better natural weapons, more efficient biology. So we adapted. Studied weak points, developed techniques that multiplied our effectiveness, got really good at pattern recognition and threat assessment. It's not complicated. We just couldn't afford to fight fair, so we got creative instead. Sounds like cowardice, someone in the gallery muttered. Sounds like survival, she corrected without heat. Call it whatever makes you comfortable. The important part is going home alive when the other person doesn't. Vexthor made a sound that surprised everyone, including possibly himself. He was laughing. The Corinthian equivalent anyway, which sounded like rocks tumbling down a mountain, but the translators insisted was amusement. I have trained since I could walk, he said. Studied every Corinthian combat form, defeated opponents from a dozen species, and I was beaten in 4 minutes by someone who learned fighting out of necessity rather than tradition. He looked around the observation gallery. This is the most valuable lesson I have received at this academy. Assumptions are more dangerous than any weapon. The human nodded acknowledgement. You're good. Really good. In a straight fight using your preferred methodology, most people wouldn't last 30 seconds. But combat isn't about preferences. It's about adaptation. Professor Krelzak was definitely smiling, which was unsettling because Vortinians didn't have mouths, as most species understood them. I believe today's lesson has been adequately demonstrated. For homework, I want 3,000 words on how preconceptions affect tactical planning. Everyone who bet on this fight gets an additional essay on why gambling on outcomes you don't understand is financially inadvisable. The groans were multilingual and heartfelt. As students filed out, conversations buzzed with analysis of what they'd witnessed. Several Corinthian students approached Vexthor with questions about technique. A few humans looked at their previously unremarkable classmate with new appreciation and possibly some concern about what other surprises their species might be hiding. The human collected her things quietly, ready to leave like this was just another day. A Pixian student, barely a foot tall and resembling a crystalline butterfly, fluttered over. That was remarkable, the Pixian said in a voice like wind chimes. How did you learn to be so calm under pressure? The human considered the question. You do something enough times, it stops being pressure and starts being process. Combat is just problem-solving with higher stakes and faster deadlines. Will you teach me? The Pixian asked. Teach you what? How to fight things 50 times your size. She smiled. You're already doing that just by being here. But sure, I can show you some techniques. Fair warning, though, my teaching style is very practical and only slightly less traumatic than actual combat. More students gathered, asking questions, requesting demonstrations, generally treating her like someone who just revealed expertise they desperately wanted. She handled it with the same calm competence she'd shown in the arena, answering questions patiently and declining requests for immediate matches with polite firmness. Vexthor approached last, after the crowd had thinned. I misjudged you. I misjudged humans. Most people do, she said without accusation. We're new, we look soft, and we don't advertise our capabilities. Easy mistake. Will you train with me again? Properly, I mean. I would learn from you. Sure, but you're going to hate it. I don't go easy, and I specialize in exploiting exactly the kind of power you rely on. Good, Vexthor said firmly. I have been going easy on myself. Time to correct that error. She grinned. Fair warning, I'm significantly more annoying when I'm teaching than when I'm fighting. My last training partner said working with me was like being educated by a particularly sarcastic combat calculator. I look forward to it. Professor Krelzak watched the exchange from his podium, making notes on his holographic display. The human wandered over after Vexthor left. Am I in trouble for that? She asked. Trouble. That was the most effective teaching moment I've had in 3 years. Half the students will actually do the reading now because they're terrified you'll demonstrate their misunderstandings personally. Krelzak's antennae twitched with amusement. Though I am curious why you didn't mention your background earlier. Your file lists prior military service, but not your specialization. You didn't ask, she said simply. And I figured I'd learn more by watching than by talking. People reveal a lot when they think you're not a threat. Strategic observation. You've been assessing the entire class. Old habits. Plus, it's useful to know who actually understands combat versus who just thinks they do. Krelzak made a note. Would you be interested in assisting with instruction? We could use someone with practical experience to balance out the theoretical curriculum. Teaching wasn't really my plan for being here. Neither was publicly humiliating one of our most arrogant students, yet here we are. And I notice you handled that with considerable skill. She laughed. Fair point. Let me think about it. As she left the arena, one of the maintenance staff, a gelatinous Blorathian who handled equipment management, wobbled over. That was extremely satisfying to observe. The Blorathian said through their translation membrane. Vexthor once criticized my species for being physically weak. I may have enjoyed his education more than is professionally appropriate. Glad I could provide entertainment. Question. Did you know you would win when you issued the challenge? The human paused, considering the question seriously. I knew I had a good chance. Combat is never certain, too many variables. But I knew his species' vulnerabilities. I'd watched him fight in training exercises, and I could predict his opening strategy with about 90% accuracy. So yeah, I was reasonably confident. Reasonably confident. You started a fight with someone twice your size on reasonably confident. Well, when you put it that way, it sounds reckless. She grinned. But I had a point to make about assumptions, and sometimes the best teaching involves practical demonstrations. The Blorathian wobbled in a way that indicated amusement. Humans are either very brave or very foolish. I have not yet determined which. Usually both, she admitted. We're still figuring that out ourselves. News of the fight spread through the Academy's social networks, with the speed that gossip always achieved, regardless of species or technology level. By evening, there were 3 different recordings circulating. 2 competing edited versions with commentary tracks, and an already outdated betting pool on whether she'd fight anyone else. In the human dormitory section, her fellow Earth students had questions. Many questions. Loud questions. Why didn't you tell us you were a bodyguard? Demanded her roommate, a human from the Pan-African Federation who'd been studying xenobiology. Didn't come up? Didn't come. You let us think you were just another student. I am just another student. I'm studying tactical coordination and xenorelations, same as you're studying how aliens digest food without dying. That's not the same, and you know it. The human flopped onto her bunk. Look, I left that life behind. Came here to learn new things. Maybe figure out how to do something other than violence for a career. Announcing, "Hi, I'm trained to kill things efficiently," doesn't really support that goal. Her roommate sat on the opposite bunk. But you're really good at it. Being good at something doesn't mean you should do it forever. I was good at my job. Kept people alive who needed to stay alive. But after a while, it starts wearing on you. The constant threat assessment, the hypervigilance, the knowledge that you're one mistake away from someone dying. I needed a break. The academy seemed like a good place to reset. And then you immediately got into a fight. He started it. I just finished it efficiently. They sat in silence for a moment. Then her roommate laughed. You know this changes everything, right? Everyone's going to want to train with you now. You're going to be the most popular human on the station. Wonderful. I came here for peace and quiet, and I'm going to get pestered by overconfident students wanting to test themselves. This is the opposite of my plan. Should have thought of that before you made Vexthor look like an amateur. In my defense, he was being extremely annoying and someone needed to educate him. And you volunteered for that responsibility out of pure altruism. Absolutely. I'm a giver. I give people valuable life lessons, usually involving pain and humiliation. Her roommate threw a pillow at her. She caught it without looking, old reflexes kicking in. They both laughed. Later, alone in the darkness, she stared at the ceiling and thought about the day's events. She hadn't wanted attention, hadn't wanted to be known as the human who could fight. She'd genuinely come to the academy hoping to learn something beyond combat, to discover if there was a version of herself that didn't revolve around violence and protection. But maybe you couldn't escape what you were good at. Maybe skill found you even when you were trying to hide from it. Or maybe, and this was the thought she kept coming back to, maybe being good at something meant you had a responsibility to use it properly. Not for ego or glory or proving points, but for teaching. For showing others what was possible. For making sure the next generation understood that strength came in many forms and assumptions could be fatal. She fell asleep thinking about curriculum development and training methodologies, which was definitely not how she'd expected her day to end when she'd woken up that morning. In another part of the station, Vexthor sat in the Corinthian communal area, surrounded by clutchmates who wanted details. He described the fight with clinical precision, highlighting every mistake he'd made and every technique she'd employed. "You are not ashamed?" one asked. "Defeated by a human?" "I am educated," Vexthor corrected. "Shame is what we feel when we fail through inadequacy. I failed through ignorance, which is correctable. Tomorrow, I begin learning human combat methodology. If they developed these techniques out of necessity, imagine what we could accomplish incorporating them into our doctrine. The Warrior Council would never approve. Then the Warrior Council will continue losing to opponents they don't understand. I prefer adaptation to tradition when tradition means defeat." This was practically heresy in Corinthian culture, but none of his clutchmates challenged it. They'd all watched the fight. They'd all seen what happened when assumption met reality. The smart ones were already thinking about implications. The galaxy was large and full of species, each with their own advantages and techniques. Refusing to learn from others because of pride wasn't strength. It was just expensive ignorance. Professor Krell-Zak filed his report on the day's events, noting the educational value and the surprising lack of serious injury. He included a recommendation that the human student be offered a teaching assistant position, along with a note that she'd probably refuse it. initially, but might be convinced with proper incentive. He also made a private note in his personal files. Humans continue to surprise. They appear fragile, act casually, then demonstrate capabilities that suggest their species evolved in an environment that rewarded creative violence. Query: what kind of planet produces beings that look soft but fight like cornered predators? Follow-up: are we sure first contact was a good idea? It was a question many species had asked about humanity. The answer remained unclear, though evidence was accumulating that humans were either the galaxy's best allies or most entertaining chaos agents. Possibly both. Definitely both. The Academy continued its rotation, students attended classes, and life proceeded with the organized chaos that characterized educational institutions across the galaxy. But something had shifted. A human had challenged assumptions and won. Others would follow her example. Some would succeed. Others would fail spectacularly and learn valuable lessons about knowing your own limitations. The galaxy was vast, ancient, and full of species that had been navigating the stars for millennia before humans figured out fire was useful for more than accidentally burning things. But humanity brought something new to the cosmic table. An absolute refusal to accept that anything was impossible, just because it was difficult, combined with enough creativity to find solutions that more established species had never considered because they'd stopped questioning their assumptions. One human in one fight in one academy wasn't going to change galactic civilization. But it was a start. A reminder that the universe was still full of surprises, and that sometimes the most dangerous opponent was the one you dismissed as harmless. And somewhere in the Academy's administrative offices, someone updated humanity's file with a new note. Revised threat assessment. Recommend against casual provocation. They're nicer than they need to be, which somehow makes them more concerning. It was, all things considered, probably the most accurate assessment anyone had made about humans since first contact. They didn't look dangerous. They didn't act dangerous most of the time. But when pushed, they demonstrated why their species had climbed to the top of Earth's food chain despite lacking claws, fangs, armor, or any sensible biological weapons. They'd gotten creative instead. And creativity, it turned out, was the most dangerous weapon of all.